The artist in his studio, painted around the year 1629, stands as one of Rembrandt van Rijn's most introspective and conceptually sophisticated early works. Executed in oil on a small wooden panel, the painting now resides in the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, where it continues to invite viewers into a world of quiet tension and artistic contemplation. The composition presents a modest, dimly lit room. Against the backdrop of bare plaster walls, simple furniture, and a few scattered objects, an artist stands before a towering canvas placed on an easel. He holds brushes in one hand, yet his stance is still and contemplative. The figure's small scale, when compared to the monumental size of the canvas, creates a striking contrast, one that subtly emphasizes the enormity of the creative task before him. Light falls from the upper left, illuminating the artist's face and tools, and guiding the viewer's gaze toward the easel. However, the canvas itself is turned away, its surface hidden from us, leaving the subject of his work an enigma. This deliberate concealment of the painted image has given rise to a range of interpretations. Some scholars regard the work as a form of self-portrait, though the figure's identity remains uncertain. More compelling, however, is the notion that the painting is not about the act of painting itself, but about the moment preceding it. A mental pause filled with anticipation, doubt, and reflection. In this sense, the work aligns with early 17th century art theory, which held that a great painting must first exist fully formed in the artist's mind before being transferred to canvas. Art historian Christopher Atkins has described the artist in his studio as a picture of thought, a term that captures its essence as a visual meditation on creativity. Rather than dramatizing the physical process of painting, Rembrandt distills the scene to its psychological core, the solitary artist confronting the daunting emptiness of a blank canvas. This is a moment charged not with visible action, but with the invisible labor of imagination. The sparse still life elements in the room, a grinding stone, a table with bottles, pallets hanging on the wall, avoid overt symbolic meaning. Instead, they contribute to the authenticity of the space, grounding the scene in the reality of a working studio. The absence of decorative flourish or narrative excess allows the viewer's attention to settle entirely on the relationship between the artist and his canvas. The artist in his studio transcends its historical context to embody a universal truth. All creation begins in solitude, in the silent dialogue between vision and execution. In elevating this moment of hesitation into a subject worthy of painting, Rembrandt not only reveals his deep understanding of the artist's inner life, but also anticipates themes of psychological depth and human vulnerability that would define his later masterpieces. In 1629, Rembrandt met Constantijn Huygens, a statesman for the court of The Hague, who could procure commissions for the artists. Huygens was a remarkable Dutchman, well informed about art, who spent most of his life in service to the princes of Orange. He operated an art academy where copies of paintings were made and commissions were fulfilled. Huygens urged the two young artists to visit Italy, especially Rome, to learn from the masterpieces, but they were too dedicated to their work in their own beloved country. Simon Schama, in his remarkable historical biography Rembrandt's Eyes, 1999, related that Huygens stated, "I feel it incumbent upon myself to state that I have never observed such dedication and persistence in other men, whatever their pursuits or ages. Truly these youths are redeeming the time. That is their sole consolation. Most amazingly, they regard even the most innocent diversions of youth as a waste of time, as if they were already burdened with age and long-past follies." Huygens had influenced Rembrandt to be more ambitious, so by 1632, Rembrandt moved back to the wealthy, teeming metropolis of Amsterdam. There, he found great satisfaction as a professional portrait painter for the successful men of commerce, the intellectuals, and the religious leaders, who were all appreciating their positions and good fortunes and wanting to exhibit their excellent taste, especially through painted likenesses of themselves. Rembrandt was building his reputation by portraying the Dutch bourgeois burghers as men of action, in three-quarter or full-length poses. Painted between the years 1629 and 1630, Samson and Delilah marks one of Rembrandt van Rijn's most compelling early explorations of biblical drama. Currently housed in the Gemäldegallery Berlin, the work captures the pivotal moment from the Old Testament narrative in the Book of Judges, wherein Samson, endowed with superhuman strength by God, is betrayed by Delilah, the woman he loves. Rembrandt's composition is charged with tension and theatricality. In a dimly lit interior, the viewer witnesses the instant after Samson has fallen into an induced sleep on Delilah's lap. A servant, or possibly a Philistine soldier, reaches forward to cut the locks of Samson's hair, the source of his divine strength, while Delilah turns her gaze away, her expression an ambiguous mix of resolve and unease. The Chiaroscuro is pronounced. Strong, concentrated light bathes the central figures, isolating them from the shadowy surroundings and lending the scene both immediacy and intimacy. The artist's treatment of the figures reveals his early mastery of human psychology. Delilah's face is rendered with soft modeling, avoiding the overt villainy found in some earlier depictions of the subject. Instead, she appears contemplative, perhaps even sorrowful, complicating the viewer's judgment of her actions. Samson, by contrast, is portrayed with heavy limbs and a slackened posture, his vulnerability emphasized through the loosened grasp of his hand and the open exposure of his head to the shears. Art historians have noted that Rembrandt's Samson and Delilah diverges from the grandiose heroism typical of earlier Baroque renditions, such as those by Rubens. Rather than framing Samson as a muscular giant locked in a climactic struggle, Rembrandt chooses the moment of quiet betrayal, the prelude to catastrophe. This focus aligns with his broader artistic interest in the psychological and moral dimensions of biblical stories, privileging the human over the purely heroic. Technically, the painting demonstrates the artist's evolving use of light as both a compositional and narrative tool. The illumination does not merely reveal form, it guides moral attention. Samson's illuminated face and Delilah's pale garments draw the eye to their physical and emotional connection, while the surrounding darkness suggests the moral ambiguity and danger enveloping the scene. The rich earthy palette, deep ochres, warm browns, and muted reds, intensifies the sense of intimacy and secrecy. Thematically, Samson and Delilah encapsulates the vulnerability inherent in human relationships, particularly when trust is betrayed. In Rembrandt's hands, the biblical episode becomes more than an illustration of divine punishment. It becomes a study in love, deception, and the fragility of human strength when stripped of its foundation. The restrained drama, concentrated lighting, and nuanced characterizations anticipate the psychological depth that would later define his mature works. In choosing to depict the moment before the irreversible act, Rembrandt invites the viewer into the charged space between intention and consequence. It is in this suspended moment, neither fully past nor fully future, that the painting's true power resides, revealing a young artist already in command of both narrative subtlety and emotional resonance. Painted in 1630, Jeremiah lamenting the destruction of Jerusalem stands among the most celebrated achievements of Rembrandt van Rijn's Leiden period. The work draws from the Old Testament account of the prophet Jeremiah, who foretold the fall of Jerusalem to the Babylonians and lived to witness the city's destruction. Far from depicting the chaos of battle or the grandeur of prophetic vision, Rembrandt focuses on the quiet, intimate aftermath, a moment of profound personal grief. The composition centers on Jeremiah, seated in the foreground, his head bowed and his face buried in his hand. His posture conveys a weight not only of sorrow, but of resignation. Draped in voluminous robes, the prophet is bathed in a concentrated beam of light that falls from the left, illuminating the furrowed lines of his brow and the coarse texture of his beard. Behind him, through a shadowy archway, the city of Jerusalem burns, its golden glow casting a faint reflection on the stone wall. The juxtaposition of the still figure with the distant conflagration creates a striking visual tension. The outer world is aflame, yet the inner world is consumed by silent despair. Symbolism pervades the work. At Jeremiah's side rests a large vessel, possibly a representation of the temple treasure, hinting at both the loss of sacred objects and the futility of material wealth in the face of divine judgment. This small but potent detail aligns with Rembrandt's narrative economy, where objects are never incidental but integral to the moral message. In terms of emotional register, Jeremiah lamenting the destruction of Jerusalem departs from the grand gestures and heroic suffering often seen in Baroque history painting. Instead, it invites contemplation. The viewer is not confronted with spectacle but drawn into the inner life of the figure, sharing in his solitude and meditative grief. This approach exemplifies Rembrandt's unique capacity to transform biblical history into a human drama of timeless relevance. Art historians have often remarked that the painting foreshadows the artist's later preoccupation with the psychology of his subjects. The expressive realism in Jeremiah's features, the sag of his shoulders, the heaviness of his hand, conveys lived experience rather than idealized pathos. The prophet is not an untouchable icon. He is an aging man who has seen his warnings ignored and his worst fears fulfilled. Ultimately, the work encapsulates a central paradox in Rembrandt's art: the beauty of light emerging from darkness, not in a triumphal sense, but as a quiet testament to endurance and faith. In capturing the stillness after destruction, Rembrandt turns a biblical lament into a universal meditation on loss, moral duty, and the resilience of the human spirit. Painted around 1630, Anna and the Blind Tobit, also known as Blind Tobit and His Wife, occupies a notable place in the early oeuvre of Rembrandt van Rijn and possibly his pupil Gerrit Dou. Currently housed in the National Gallery, London, the painting draws on the apocryphal Book of Tobit, a text that was particularly popular in 17th century Protestant and Catholic households for its themes of faith, perseverance, and divine providence. The narrative centers on Tobit, an elderly pious Israelite living in exile who has been struck blind. In the painting, Tobit sits hunched, his eyes closed, leaning forward with a sense of quiet resignation. Beside him stands Anna, his devoted wife, engaged in domestic labor, often interpreted as spinning or preparing wool, her face illuminated by a warm shaft of light. Rembrandt eschews grand narrative in favor of a moment of ordinary life imbued with quiet dignity. A hallmark of Rembrandt's Leiden period is the dramatic use of chiaroscuro, here employed to striking effect. The figures emerge from a deep, tenebrous background, the play of light not only revealing textures, the coarse fibers of the wool, the weathered skin of the old man, the rough grain of the wooden table, but also functioning as a theological metaphor. The illumination that touches Anna's face and hands can be read as a symbol of steadfast faith and humble labor, virtues that sustain the household in the absence of worldly fortune. The domestic interior is rendered with meticulous attention to detail, a quality often associated with Gerrit Dou's influence. If Dou did indeed contribute to the work, his hand may be seen in the refined still life elements, the carefully depicted tools, the subtle glint of metal, and the delicate transitions of light on everyday objects. These details root the biblical scene in the lived reality of a 17th century Dutch home, bridging sacred history and contemporary life. Symbolism operates quietly but persistently. Tobit's closed eyes and bowed head evoke the inward gaze of prayer and meditation, while Anna's labor suggests the sustaining power of practical devotion. The composition's modest scale and intimate atmosphere reflect a theological and cultural preference for moral exemplar drawn from ordinary existence, aligning with the Calvinist ethos of moral discipline and humility. What distinguishes Anna and the Blind Tobit from many contemporaneous religious works is its refusal to dramatize suffering. Instead, the painting dwells on endurance, the slow work of faith expressed in the repetitive gestures of daily life. This psychological subtlety is an early indicator of Rembrandt's mature approach, where emotional truth outweighs theatrical display. The painting is less a literal illustration of the Book of Tobit than a meditation on the virtues of constancy and mutual care. By framing divine trial within the textures of the everyday, Rembrandt, and possibly Gerrit Dou, invite the viewer to see the sacred in the ordinary and to recognize that even in the shadow of blindness, there is a light that endures. Painted between 1630 and 1632, the Raising of Lazarus marks one of Rembrandt van Rijn's earliest and most ambitious explorations of biblical drama. Executed in oil on panel, the work is housed today in the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. Its subject derives from the Gospel of John, chapter 11, the moment when Christ calls Lazarus forth from the tomb, affirming his divine authority over life and death. Rembrandt approaches the scene with a striking theatrical sensibility. The composition is steeped in chiaroscuro, with darkness enveloping the majority of the space, allowing the central beam of light to fall upon Lazarus's partially risen body, Christ's outstretched arm, and the stunned faces of the onlookers. This interplay of light and shadow not only orchestrates the viewer's gaze, but also mirrors the theological transition from spiritual death to renewed life. The figures are arranged to emphasize psychological response over decorative balance. Christ, positioned to the left of center, is cloaked in a radiance that subtly distinguishes him from the surrounding gloom. His gesture, commanding yet tender, bridges the divine and the human. Lazarus, still shrouded in burial cloths, turns his head toward the source of light, his movement arrested between death's inertia and the pull of new vitality. Around them, the witnesses exhibit a range of emotional states: awe, disbelief, and reverent fear. Technically, the painting demonstrates Rembrandt's rapid mastery of dramatic narrative. The brushwork is vigorous in the shadowed areas, lending them a sense of depth and uncertainty, while more precise modeling is reserved for the illuminated forms. The limited palette, dominated by earthy browns, ochres, and muted golds, intensifies the scene's solemnity, avoiding the decorative richness common in earlier northern religious art. Thematically, the Raising of Lazarus serves as both a literal biblical illustration and a visual meditation on the mystery of resurrection. Light becomes the central theological metaphor, with Christ as its source. The darkness surrounding the tomb suggests not only physical death but also spiritual ignorance, pierced by the radiance of divine truth. In this respect, Rembrandt's interpretation departs from the more symmetrical and idealized versions by Italian predecessors, favoring instead a raw immediacy rooted in lived human experience. As an early work, the painting foreshadows key traits of Rembrandt's mature style. His emphasis on the psychological over the ornamental, his deep engagement with biblical text, and his use of light as both narrative and symbolic agent. The Raising of Lazarus thus stands as a formative example of how the young artist could fuse theological depth with pictorial innovation, setting the stage for his later masterpieces.